Hello learners, welcome to our session today. I'm your instructor, 𝒲𝒽𝒴 𝒴𝓉. So in our class today, we are going to handle a very important concept. And this concept, my good students, I want you to approach it with an open mind, not only for the purpose of you maybe applying it in examination, but also with that aspect of gaining that knowledge for you to apply it practically. And this concept that we are going to handle today is what we normally term it as what? Variance analysis. This concept is a concept of variance analysis. I know probably you've heard that variance analysis, that concept is very hard, but I want to tell you that this concept is one of the easiest concepts that you must always have. So long as you approach it with an open mind, that's the first rule. The second rule is that don't cram the formulas, because if you cram the formulas, you're going to mess big time. So it's all about understanding the concept behind it. And that's why in our class, we will not be using acronyms in variance analysis. Let's use acronyms in other areas, but it's not in this concept. Because if you try to use acronyms on this, it will be kind of as if you are cramming the formulas. And I don't want us to approach it in that case. I want us to approach it with the mind of understanding the whole bit of variance analysis. So, after we've noted the rules that we should be applying in this concept, we can start now handling the concept of variance analysis. It is a very key and also a very important concept. So, looking at variance analysis, the first thing that you must always ring at the back of your mind, you see I'll be talking of variance as it is, and I'll also be looking at the analysis part of it. I'll also be looking at the analysis part of it. So, what is variance? Whenever we'll be talking of variance, ideally, I'll just be looking at the difference between what we had budgeted and our actual results. This is what will give us variance. Ideally, variance is a difference. Difference between what? The difference between the budgeted data and the actual data. You can just take example, practical example. Probably today you decided that you're going to maybe a supermarket, or because you're Kenyans, maybe on your way you decided to purchase an item, say like talk of shoes. Your budget, assuming was in this case you're looking at cost, right? You want to purchase a shoe. Labda ukitembea pale mtaani ama ukitembea on aspect of the streets of Nairobi, the hawkers wameweka pale vitu kwa street. So it's kind of you want to purchase an item there, right? Of course, you have an aspect of bargaining. You can go there and do your bargain. So in this case, you have estimated that you're going to purchase that shoe. Maybe you have 1,000 shillings, the one that you had budgeted. That is your budget. You budgeted to go and purchase that shoes at 1,000 shillings. But the actual amount, maybe because your bargaining power is very high, you've gone there, you've bargained to the point that you end up purchasing this item at 800 shillings. Remember, what are you budgeted? You're budgeted purchase. At the back of your mind, you knew very well that you're going to purchase this item at 1,000 shillings. But because you reach there, you find that you have an option of bargaining. You bargain till you purchase that item at 800 shillings. In this case, I'd be having a difference of what I'd budgeted and of what I'm actually incurring. So you'll find that the difference here, I'd be having a figure of 200 shillings as our difference. So this difference is what I'm going to term it as variance. This is a variance. I'd budgeted to spend 1,000, I'm ending up spending 800. So I'm having a variance of 200. Now, it is at this point that probably we will be looking at the form of variance that we will be talking about. And ideally, I'll be looking at favorable variance and adverse variances, which we'll be mentioning. So we'll find that in this case, this is a cost. I'm having a variance. A good question will be, is this variance against us, or is this variance in favor of us? That's a good question that you should ask yourself. Is this variance against us, or is this variance in favor of us? You'll find that at this point, this variance is in favor of us because I budgeted to spend 1,000. I'm ending up spending 800. So this variance is in favor of us. And at any given point, whenever variance is in favor of us, we normally term it as what? Favorable variance. We normally term it as favorable variance. That variance is in favor of us. What if the same scenario, you had budgeted to go to purchase our shoes at 1,000 shillings, but probably because you really want that shoes, but you find in the market that shoe is going for 1,300 shillings. But you end up purchasing it because you really need that shoes. So you'll find that in this case, I budgeted to spend 1,000, but I'm ending up spending more than what I budgeted. I'll be having a difference or a variance of 300. So you'll find that this difference is against us. And at any given point, whenever we have a variance that is against us, we normally term that as adverse variance. We normally term that as adverse variance. We normally term that as adverse variance. So up to this point, I know you've learned at least two main elements. That I'll be talking of favorable variance and I'll be talking of adverse variance. And whenever I'm looking at cost, at any given point, whenever the actual results is less than what I'd budgeted in relation to cost, in that case, that will always give us what? A favorable variance. And in the event that my budgeted data is lower, or rather our actual results or actual cost is more than the budgeted, in that case I'll be having what is known as what? As adverse variance. So after we've looked at that two components, remember at this point you are looking at it in form of what? In form of cost. What if we were to look at it in regard to revenues? What will you be having? Same scenario, but this time around I'm looking at what? I'm looking at revenues. Looking at revenues, the hawker now, he had a plan to receive, or he had budgeted to receive 1,000 shillings, but he ends up receiving 700 shillings. This is revenue. You'll find that I'll be having a variance of 300. But this 300, you'll find that this is against me. This is against us, meaning that you are terming it as what? As adverse variance. Why are we terming it as adverse variance? Because I had anticipated to receive 1,000 shillings, but to end up receiving 700 shillings, meaning that I'm receiving an income lower than what I had anticipated. So that's why you are terming it as what? As adverse variance. Take another scenario. Yes, you had a plan to receive 1,000 shillings, but you end up receiving 1,400. So you'll find that you'll be having a variance of 400. So this 400, we are going to term it as a favorable variance. Why are we terming it as a favorable variance? Because in this case, you'll find that I'm receiving more than what I had anticipated. So in such a case, I'm going to term it as a favorable variance. So this case, we'll be talking of what? Favorable variance. We'll be talking of a favorable variance. So clearly, you can see a clear distinction between whenever I'm talking of adverse and favorable between revenues and what? And cost. Where in cost, if our actual is more than budgeted, in that case is what? Is adverse. Where in revenue, if our actual is more than budgeted, in that case we'll be having what? Favorable variance. And as we've clearly explained that favorable variance, and we've also explained the aspect of adverse variance. Knowing that, it has given us a clear idea of what variance is. Now, the process that we will be taking to do the analysis of the variances that we've obtained, that is what you are going to term it as what? Analysis. And what will we be analyzing? We'll be analyzing the variances that we'll have computed. So basically, we find that variance analysis is to just be a matter of us analyzing the variance that we have obtained. And basically, that's a basic knowledge of variance that you should always be having at the back of your mind. So even as we proceed, as we'll be looking at so many questions in relation to this, always try to clearly define and understand the concept of variance. What we've just mentioned here, So, after we've looked at the concept behind the variance analysis, I want us now to introduce it clearly. Now, talk of variance analysis, I know by now you can give us a definition of what variance analysis is, because remember, we've looked at the whole concept of variance analysis. So if you are to ask what variance is, what will you say? If you are to ask what variance is, what will you say? So basically, we normally say that variance is the difference between a planned variance. This is the difference between, we normally talk of variance as the difference between, difference between variance is the difference between planned, budgeted, or standard cost, or standard cost, and the actual cost incurred, and the actual cost incurred, and the actual cost incurred, and the actual cost incurred. So that is what you are terming it as what? As variance. As the difference between planned, budgeted, or standard cost and the actual cost incurred, What about analysis? So because at this point, remember, the same comparison, of course, can be made on revenue. We can also say the same comparison can also be made, can also be made on revenue, The same comparison can also be made on revenues. So that is variance analysis. That is, or rather, that is aspect of variance. Now, what about variance analysis? So we'll find now the process by which the process by which the total difference, the process by which the total difference between standard and actual, results is analyzed. The process by which the total difference between standard and actual results is analyzed is known as variance analysis. So that is a very clear definition of variance and also the aspect of variance analysis. So always, whenever we'll be talking of this concept, you'll find that I'll be looking at two perspectives. I'll be looking at the definition of variance, and also I'll be looking at now the process by which we are analyzing these differences. Is what we are going to term it as what? As variance analysis, just as we have mentioned at that point. and that is very key. At least we are now making step, we are now digging deep towards this concept of variance analysis. Now, just repeating again what I had mentioned earlier on when we started, you'll find that we can often say, when the actual results, this one I'm going to write it with a blue pen so that you should not forget. We normally say that when actual results are better, when actual results are better than the expected, when actual results are better than the expected, when actual results are better than the expected, we have a favorable variance. 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 That is what you had mentioned also earlier on. And in this case, we normally denote it by F. When actual results are better than expected, we have a favorable variance. And in that case, we find that we denote it by F. And what if our actual results are worse than expected results? When actual results are worse than the expected, we have an adverse variance. We have an adverse variance. And in this case, we normally denote it by what? A. Remember, that is what I had mentioned also earlier on when we started the concept of variance analysis. So my good student, up to this point, at least you can clearly say that you have that idea of what variance is, what variance analysis is, and also how you can differentiate between a favorable variance and adverse variance. So after we've talked of that, the next area that I'll also want us to look at, in this case you'll find that we'll want to see the division of variance. We'll want to see the division of variance. So whenever we'll be talking of variance analysis, how is it divided? And that's the next area that I want us to look. So I believe you have this on paper. So the next thing that I'll also want us to talk about is the aspect of division of variance analysis. That's the next concept that I'll also want us to talk about, the aspect of division of variance analysis. And clearly, we normally say that our variance analysis, we divided them into these categories. So whenever I'm talking of variance analysis, at the back of your mind, you must always have this in mind. So talk of variance analysis. Whenever I'm talking of variance analysis, this should ring at the back of our mind. Whenever you're talking of variance analysis, this should ring at the back of our mind. We are going to have that division. So I'm having variance analysis, and in that case, you'll find that the variance analysis is going to be categorized into the following. So in that case, I'll be talking of, let us have form of a chart. On this case, we can talk of what is known as material variances. Number two, we can talk of labor variances. 3, we can talk of the aspect of what is known as variable overhead variances. Variable overhead variances. Allow me to use V. Talk of what? Fixed overhead variances. Talk of fixed overhead variances. Talk of fixed overhead variances. And the last one, common, that we normally talk about, we normally talk of the aspect of what is known as what? The sales variances. Talk of our sales variances. Talk of our sales variances. So this is what we normally talk of, the basic variances that we normally talk about. Basic variance that we normally talk about. Now later on you'll find that again these variances will be split into several components. These variances will be split into several components. But at this point, what you should have at the back of your mind is that whenever I'll be talking of variances, I'll be talking of main elements: material variances, labor variances, variable overhead variances, fixed overhead variance, and the aspect of the sales variances. Very key that you must always have this in mind. That you must always have this in mind. So that looking at it, if you are to split it further, if we were to split it further, this is form of a tree, right? This is form of a tree. If we are to split it further, you'll find that I'll be talking of material variances. First of all, I'll be talking of a material price variance and material usage variance. So MPV, this stands for material price variance, and this stands for material usage variance. And on the other case, I'll be talking of labor rate variance, and I'll be talking of labor efficiency variance. So this is labor rate variance, LEV, labor efficiency variance. And my good students, though we'll be looking at how we can get the formula at once, but you'll find that if we combine these two, this will give us what? Total material cost variance. This will give us what? Total labor cost variance. If we combine the two, if you add the two. So after we talked of that, you'll find that on variable overhead variance, again, is going to be divided into two. Because at this point, we'll be looking at what is known as what? Variable overhead expenditure variance, variable overhead expenditure variance. And we'll be talking of variable overhead efficiency variance. Don't worry, because you are going to look at this, you are going to look at this, each individual component. So this is material price, material usage, labor rate variance, labor efficiency variance, variable overhead expenditure variance, variable overhead efficiency variance. What about fixed overhead? Again, the same concept is going to be divided into two main. We'll be talking of what? We'll be talking of fixed overhead expenditure variance. So in that case, we'll be talking of, again, fixed overhead variance is divided into two, of which in this case we'll be talking of what? I'll be talking of fixed overhead expenditure variance, and I'll be talking of fixed overhead volume variance. I'll be talking of fixed overhead volume variance. And the beauty part of this is that so long as you understand the concept, don't cram the formulas, it will be very easy for you. So in that case, we've talked of fixed overhead. Now the final part that we'll be talking about, I'll be talking of the sales variances. And looking at the sales variances, the same concept, I'll be talking of two main. And in that case, I'll be talking of sales price variance, and I'll be talking of sales volume variance. Very key and very important for us to get this concept clearly. So this is what we should be having. That is what we should be having. That is what we should be having. Now, after understanding this concept clearly in regard to the aspect of categories of variances, I'll be very comfortable if we start handling each one by one. Understanding the whole concept of material variance, we go ahead and look at labor variance, variable overhead variance, fixed overhead variance, and also the aspect of what? Sales variances. So, this chart is going to guide us in looking at the whole of variance analysis. So later on we'll find that we'll be viewing this category of labor efficiency being probably categorized into the component of what is known as the aspect of yield variance, and also the same case we'll be talking of mixed variances later on. But to this point now, I want us to handle each and every concept individually, assisting us to understand the whole concept, assisting us to understand the whole concept. So allow me to erase here, 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 so that we can introduce our first component of variance, which we talked about as material variances. Material variances. The beauty part with variance analysis is, so long as you have the concept right, there is no way that this concept is going to be very hard on you. However, how the examiner will twist the question, so long as you understood the concept clearly. And we've said in our class, we are not going to cram the formulas. We are not going to use any form of acronyms. Acronyms will not assist you to get the concept clearly. This time, we will be understanding the whole concept. How are we arriving at this? How are we arriving at this? And not other components. So that's why I'm really insisting that try to understand the concept. Don't cram the formulas. Try to understand the concept. Let us use acronyms like in SG. Let us use acronyms in other concepts, but not variance analysis, because it is very key for you to understand this concept clearly. Now, after we mentioned that, we can now introduce